Hi everyone. I want to talk a little bit today about a framework that I've been using lately to help me make decisions a little bit better. And I call this the 4B framework, which is basically a decision making model. And the goal of it is to simplify complexity, it's to bring clarity, it's to bring order to chaos. I think regardless of where you're working, whether it's the private sector, teams, professional sports, it doesn't matter. I think as a professional, as an individual, I think it's important to have some sort of framework in place when it comes to these type of things. At least there are a million frameworks and a million systems about a bunch of different stuff, but when it comes to decision making, this is one that I like and that I find myself using a lot, especially when I'm on the field working with sports. So let's try to go through it. All right, so what does the framework exist in the first place? I think anyone working in professional or in high performance environments is probably gonna agree that the main challenge that we face is not necessarily abundance of knowledge, abundance of data. I think it's more about a lack of a structure and decision making. So I think this framework, what it does is that it brings clarity into that decision making. So the goal is not to do more or to measure more, is to decide better. And I think that's where a lot of us get it wrong, so to speak. So that's the solution or the challenge that we're trying to solve with this type of framework. So the model itself, let me get myself out of the way. When we think about models and systems and frameworks, we're talking about reusable, repeatable things that allow us to be more efficient at what we're trying to do in the first place. So that's what system thinking is at its core. So when we're talking about performance specifically, we're saying that it's a system that is ultimately constrained by human biology. It doesn't matter how much you want to achieve and how fast. Ultimately, that's going to be constrained by the overarching constraint, sorry that I'm repeating myself, of that individual, of that scenario in particular. We're going to dive deeper on that in a little bit. So we also have to consider what are the primary outcomes that we're looking at. Sometimes it's availability, sometimes it's longevity, sometimes it's sustainable output. This is going to depend on what type of environment you're working on. But we need to have a clear picture of what are the primary outcomes that we're looking at. And ultimately, it should lead to better decisions. If it doesn't, then it needs to continue to be, worked on. So what we're trying to do is remove the friction between goals and constraints, right? That's the ultimate goal that a model or a framework or a system or however you want to call it, it's going to achieve, or it's going to lead you to that ultimate goal. All right, so I don't know how to work this. So this is an overview of the 4B framework, as I like to call it. And I call it 4B because it's 4Bs. So the first one is about bucketing. It's about sorting out the problem without actually solving it. It's removing emotion from what we're looking at and simply just getting the facts. Rich is the other B, and it's all about looking for relationships between domains and connecting the dots. It's what's the story that you're getting out of the bucket or the sorting of information that you're facing right now. The third B is for build, and this is where we design how to solve the problem that we're looking at ultimately. And boundary, this is where it gets a little bit tricky for people because it's going to be different depending on a lot of things. There might be some professional teams that are optimizing for performance right now. There are other teams that might be optimizing for development. Personally, I like to optimize for longevity when it comes to the work that I do. And one important thing about this framework is that you cannot skip step. If you do, number one, it's not a 4B framework, but third, you're going to leave out a crucial piece of the process by leaving one out. For example, let's say you decide to leave out bucket one. That means that you're going to try to diagnose relationships between domains where you don't even understand the full scope of the reality that you're dealing with. Let's say you're trying to bucket and then skip and build. That means that you're simply gathering information, understanding what the problem is, and not doing anything about it. So I think like having a cohesive flow of all the 4 steps, it's going to yield the better results down the road. So let's continue and let's try to go a little bit deeper into each bucket. So the first one, the first B, well, a bucket, I like to call it a sort of reality, right? We're just trying to figure out what's real, what's not, and then we're going to worry about fixing that reality. So here we're dealing with constraints and we're trying to identify what are those constraints. So I like myself to bucket into 3 categories: medical, physical, and technical. So when we're talking about medical, we're talking about hard constraints. We're talking about things that are almost impossible to work through them. You have to work around them. You have to work with them. That might be pain. That might be tissue intolerance. That might be injury history. That might be a current pathology. Those kind of things. The physical bucket, it's more about modifiable constraints. These are constraints that can be changed through time with the correct dosage of exercise and prescription. So we're talking capacity, strength, range of motion, power, you name it. These are constraints that they're present, but they are definitely modifiable through time. Bucket, and this is how constraints are expressed, and that might be skill execution or in sport mechanics. In this particular environment, if we're talking about something else that has nothing to do with sports, maybe organizational, it might look like something different. But when I'm looking at a situation, a problem, the first thing that I do is that in my head, I try to sort reality and bucket each item where I think it belongs the best. And that just helps me understand what I'm actually dealing with. The second framework, or part of the framework, is the bridge. So this is where we actually make a story about the reality that we just gathered, right? This is where we make sense out of it. And we need to understand that performance problems rarely live in one bucket. It's never just one issue. So these are the questions that I tend to ask myself. How do the buckets influence each other? Which one is driving the problem? Which one is adapting? Which one is being blamed incorrectly? And when I go through those 4 questions based on the reality that I just gathered, the story that I tell myself, it's pretty simple and it just makes the most sense for me. And we're gonna run through a little case study. This is one, I made it up. This is up for a professional baseball player. And the context that we're gathering here, this is step 1. And we're just sorting information, right? Without any type of emotion, without nothing. And let's just say that this athlete here is experiencing a mild anterior hip pain that he's classifying as 2 out of 3 on a 0 to 10 scale. We've seen some drop in sprint velocity and swing efficiency, has not missed any games so far. Okay, so this is just the plain reality of what we're currently dealing with. So when I bucket each of these, I'm saying that when it comes to medical, we're looking at a low-grade, low-dependent pain. Physical is probably going to be facing some sort of reduced hip IR, force at high velocity. And when it comes to technical skill expression, he's experiencing shortened stride and early pelvic rotation. This is going to look completely different, obviously, depending on what type of reality you're dealing with. So when we go to bucket number 2, or with B number 2, this is bridge, right? This is where we're connecting the dots. This is where we're making a storytelling out of the reality that we just gathered. So we're looking at a physical limitation is driving technical compensation. It's usually how it goes. That technical compensation is increasing tissue load, and we can infer that pain is a signal, not the root problem. Obviously, this is an oversimplification of how you would use this type of part of the framework, but it's just a way of showing you guys that it's basically putting a story into the data that we just collected. Okay, so let's proceed. So when we move on to the third B, this is where we become architects. This is where we design a constraint-driven intervention. And the constraint, it's very important to highlight, and this is something that is not new, but it's really hard to design something useful without first understanding what are the constraints, right? What are the hard constraints, the modifiable constraints, and how are those constraints are currently being expressed. So let's say that we have all of that sorted out. We already make sense out of the reality that we're dealing with, and we're ready to design an intervention. And by this, I mean a program, right? An exercise, mesocycle, however you want to call it. So when it comes to this, regardless of the type of program that I'm building or that I'm writing, I have three things in mind. First one is protect. We don't want to worsen whatever it is that we're dealing with, right? In this case, what we want to protect the athlete is from high-speed exposure. Running too fast, too soon. Let's just hold off our horses, protect the guy, let's preserve equanimity. Other thing that I would move on to is correct, right? Now that we're in a safe space, let's try to correct and work around the constraints that we can. In this case, probably better the hip IR. And the last part of the build is the part that I like the most. This is where we're breaking the silos between departments. This is where strength and conditioning coaches, athletic trainers, physios, the medical departments come into play, and the skill development teams also come into place. So we align on a diagnose, we align on a return to play timeline, and we push and develop performance in order to get the athlete to that point in particular. So this is the third component of the third B of the framework. The last one, again, like I mentioned at the beginning, the boundary component is going to vary depending on where you're working. In this case, I'm saying that we're optimizing for longevity, and in order to do that, we need to define our guardrails. If you're looking to stay or to develop and protect a player for the next 10 years, you need to set a really hard standard. So we need to worry about where are the load ceilings that we're looking at with this player. We have to understand the maximum training volume, the minimum training volume, the intensity thresholds, when to pull back, when to push. We need to really understand the load ceilings when it comes to longevity. We need to understand how to manage the symptoms during activity. Athlete just finished running the bases. He felt a 2 out of 10 when running through second. We need to understand what that means. How do we go from there? Where do we go from there? And progression timelines. We need to establish criteria and protocols and checkpoints to better communicate and assess when it's safe for the athlete to move on, and what are we communicating to the other departments that we're working with. Okay. So finally, this is how it looks in general. So first, we bucket. You need to sort reality. You need to understand what are you actually dealing with before you make any other decision, before you try to solve anything. Then you bridge. This is the second B of the framework. This is where you connect the dots. This is where you tell the story about what you're working with. Then you build. In building, we're designing with intent. We understand the reality. We understand the constraints. We know the story. Now let's design a program, a micro mesocycle that makes complete sense with the rest of the staff, right? Integrating, not isolating. And then the 4B is about boundaries. So this is where I personally prioritize for longevity, right? So what we're trying to do, and what the framework ultimately scales, is simply reducing noise. It's improving clarity, specifically decision clarity. It creates shared language and supports leadership decisions. So again, regardless of what type of job you're currently doing, whether you are in the private sector, professional sports, college sector, it doesn't matter. I think having in place as an individual handle a lot of information quicker and more efficiently, it's going to be a game changer down the line. Hope you guys made sense out of it, and if you have any questions, just drop them below. Peace.